Still alive, bitches. Alright, today, sorry about that. It's me, Nails, here, and I'm mad. But that also means I'm happy, because I'm only happy when I'm mad, and I'm only mad when I'm happy. Because I'm a psychopath. That's the bit! No, I'm just kidding. The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson is one of my top 10 favorite books of all time. So I'm going to do the briefest review I can to keep your short attention span. So basically, in 2010, Brandon Sanderson was still a relatively new author before he took over fantasy, and this was his definitive, I'm not going to sell out any single detail of the production for anyone. This is the type of book I want to make. And because his publishers were saying, oh, you got to make it more dark, you got to make it more grimdark, like the popularity of George Martin, because they're all about the money at the time, I guess. And he's like, and they're like, oh, you write too much, you have too many details. Look at this beast of a book. You got to make it shorter, and cut things out. And when he was under all this pressure to take advice from people that know what they're talking about to an extent. They know what sells, they know what's popular, they know what's commercial. But that's where he went from being the type of person to be a crowd pleaser to being a trendsetter and doing something new that's converting people to expand how they look at books and fantasy and fiction. And so he said, no, I'm going to do this for me. I'm going to write the book, the masterpiece that I want to write. It already published a few books. And so he wrote, he took the story that he'd been working on for years, and it had undergone many changes. He had ideas for the story since the 90s, and then worked his butt off, and then eventually published it in 2010. And this is the first book of the now world-famous Stormlight archive. And so what you have here is some people call it hope punk. I like that. It's like a new genre name. Epic, extremely epic, heroic fantasy with a lot of magic, but almost with the magic systems and the world almost have a sci-fi feel. And in some ways, you could argue that it blends sci-fi slightly into fantasy, and I really love that. So it's a smarter fantasy, but it feels, and although it takes leaps and bounds in logic, the magic systems are so complex and interweaved with the world so believably that it feels like it's very grounded. And although the prose is good, it's not very artful, because the world is so real that the prose is secondary for shaping the world. And so it makes for some of the most vivid visuals in your mind when you read at the same time. And in epic scenes, it really it stirs the better sides of your emotions, the ones that are a little bit more like touching upon the divine in you, so to say. And that's probably, although the story is, epic and wonderful, I think the biggest, most unique takeaway from The Way of Kings, the most memorable features are the world building, and just the way Sanderson constructs all the original elements of magic systems and world building. And then when action comes in at a defining arc, like a culminating moment of decision that will steer the character's, destiny, new expanding the mind and of the character, coming to a cathartic realization of who they are, with themes of destiny and callings and stewardships and responsibilities that access their link to some sort of larger, supposed omnipresent living force of energy, which is this background theme that is not explained all at once, but you're given little insights that are sprinkled throughout the narrative that you're supposed to sort of glean it as a summation of a realization of the worlds. And so the book is, not for those that are impatient, but it does intellectually expand your mind, to your imagination. And if you stick with it and diligently get to the end, it makes for a more emotionally satisfying dramatic payoff that has so many scenes and moments that are eternally memorable that I don't really want to spoil. So I would say that I cannot think of a more universally worthier example of the definition of the most current commercially like not accessible, highest quality commercial level fantasy that has universal appeal, than the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. I think it's the best in the entire world. It's not my personal favorite fantasy series, but it's hard to pick a favorite because they're all like, different fruits. They're all different in their own way. And so my personal favorite fantasy series is Song of Ice and Fire by George Martin. But I love this book pretty much to this book series to the same level for opposite reasons. I read The Way of Kings when I want to feel a sort of like temperate energy, and a reminder of like coming back down to who you are by projecting, valiant, noble, virtuous qualities in the characters as you're envisioning them. So it's so now some of the more challenging aspects that are ironically both positive and negative takeaways. There's so many intertwining character story arcs, not quite as many characters as a epic fantasy like Song of Ice and Fire, and not quite as much courtly like kings and successions history affairs, but there is so much brief interjections of world building of like it feels like you're reading a series of Wikipedia articles like all torn apart and mixed together with ongoing explanations of things that more or less deliberately slows down the narrative. And some people like that, and I'm definitely included. I like a book that has a slow burn quality that is more about the journey than the destination, if you know what I mean. Sorry about the background noise. Can't be helped. Don't want the pipes to freeze. So, essentially, this book is more than just the main story, but you could also argue for less patient readers that want more forward-moving plot and action. They probably would find that extremely tedious if you're not into having the time and patience to sit down and engage in a fantasy world, because it is hard to care and keep track of so many little things, especially when they're isolated from the emotional resonance of the moving narrative, and it doesn't make sense to you as why it matters, and it sometimes can tend to feel like a waste of time. But for me, no, because as an art piece and as a story, more world building equals more realization, and that means more realism, and that gets me into the story more. So it just fuels the emotional, like the scenes of the narrative that take place in my mind. Like I said, it's very visually dazzling if you get in the zone and get in the mood and have the patience to sit down and read it. It's like, and then by the time, in my personal opinion, because it is a war story, by the time the main characters are moving to greater and greater action to actually apply the investments of universal like knowledge of how energy in the universe works in Stormlight, essentially, it makes more sense and it all comes together. So Brandon Sanderson is like an evil genius, extremely intelligent person. It almost feels like Brandon Sanderson almost feels like a person that was meant to be like Albert Einstein, but instead, if Albert Einstein wrote fantasy novels, if you know what I mean, because usually he's also known for his like plot twists at times and really satisfying endings, but his endings always take such a small percentage of the book and then have this bizarre culmination and explosion of like satisfaction in terms of character arcs like coming full circle and having exciting dramatic conclusions, and then suddenly things make sense. But that requires so much faith and patience that it can actually be a nightmare. The first time reading The Way of Kings, I got about this far, and then all of a sudden I felt like I was missing information because I was having such a hard time like remembering things and paying attention. So I restarted it, and then I read the entire thing and enjoyed it, but I found the ending to be like not satisfying because I didn't really, but in the process I was sort of like had a love-hate relationship with my first reading of it. I sort of got sold on the idea of just enjoying the ride, and that's when I got more converted to the art of, having more fun projecting and imagining this universe with the book as a catalyst, which in a word, almost mystical meta way, really does feel like a real place. By the way, Roshar is so it's such a it just feels like a living place. This book is like a portal to another world, and so essentially, I immediately wanted to read it again, but I took my time. I believe I went on to read Words of Radiance and had a similar experience, and I liked Words of Radiance even more. And then years went by, and I didn't have time for Oathbringer, and then I eventually decided too much time went by in my life, and that I first read this in 2018, and then I was like, okay, I want to continue to Oathbringer, but I want to reread The Way of Kings because I liked it so much, and the story, and Words of Radiance again because I missed so much, because even at the end of Words of Radiance, there's so many things they're talking about that I missed track of, and I'm just like, how does this all make sense? So a small complaint is some of the big dramatic story arcs, unless you're, adamantly paying attention to all this little world building, like when they're talking about, other dimensions, the theologies, the different belief systems, the intentions of the different races in Roshar, and how it ultimately is invested in certain deities and certain large magic systems. Like the challenge of keeping track of the complexity is actually part of the fun, but that's gonna be a turnoff to a lot of people that want more instant gratification or pulp. This book is not that. This book is slow, and then it has very like real life, realistic moments of charging up, like adrenaline, action, satisfying developments in character relationships, romances, and it does so much that like these characters feel real. Not only are they feel real, but they feel like actual role models, like classic epic good characters in any fiction, like classic works of literature. So it is like in many ways like ahead of its time, and many ways reminiscent of classy aspects of fantasy in the past, but it's also something it's just so excellent in balancing so many good qualities in so many areas that it really is a masterpiece in just coming together to make something that's never really been done before, and I don't think I'll ever live to see its equal in my lifetime. Honestly, the Stormlight Archive is incredible, and also has so much universal appeal, and I lost my train of thought of what I was talking about before that. So basically, that's my story. I eventually went back and I reread The Way of Kings for the second time, I think I started it and got like this far, and then more time went by, got busy with life, with work, and then I went back and then I restarted it again and I read it for the second and a half time, so to say, and finished it, and that was the most enjoyment I had, because by then I had learned how to read it, and then I started Words of Radiance again. And this time I plan on just reading the books one after another in their entirety, as I never have gotten to Oathbringer, which I've been trying to get to since it came out in like 2018, and the last 6 years have just gone by in a flash. But it's crazy to think that this came out in 2010 and it's already 2025. That just blows my mind, because it still feels fresh and new. And the weirdest thing of all is that this book, for people that are new to big, complex fictional universes, who want to get on the hype wagon that the name Brandon Sanderson has become in literature, you've been warned. Like it is a challenge, but the challenge is both the frustrating and the most satisfying part of that at the same time, and it's worth it throughout. And it just might convert you to having a more temperate sense or appreciation of nuance and how your mind, the sort of qualities, the universal truths reflected in the universal patterns in the narrative, like themes like what is The Way of Kings, for example. I don't want to spoil anything. I don't want to talk about the story too much, but it's essentially taking on responsibility, and it's that weight of responsibility that it's so many things, but this is just one loose interpretation. That's the sort of thing that empowers you to get a sense of identity and become something, so to say, instead of just going. It's also a story of going from total obscurity and pain, and taking control of your life with a coming of age element, with a character that has realistic, a very grounded, realistic, relatable mental illness, which is another favorite unique quality of the book, depression, that is connected to trauma and past relatable instances of betrayal, that is just universally relatable and nostalgic to anyone that's ever, survived puberty, essentially becoming an adult and becoming, self-sufficient, and dealing with the reality of the evil in human nature as well, and especially as it's seen through a very fantastical take on, classic kingdoms and monarchies and the corruption and power struggles, and especially with the character Dalinar, who's starting to realize that most of his life has actually always been tainted by something that lacks, the actual honor codes of the past, and his present generation is not really living up to it. So he's basically been living his life on autopilot, and wants to make a reconnection to what would actually be the way of kings in a very general sense. That's just my personal interpretation, because I don't have time to get into big deep details, but I could easily talk about this book for hours, because it is just so jam-packed with meaning that, like I said before, you could see similarities to your life and you will remember for the rest of your life. It's a story that you actually can take a little bit of enlightenment, a lot of inspiration from. It's good for people that have depression. It's good for people that have dealt with unfair things, and it's just such a it's almost a religious experience. It's such a inspiring spiritual sort of journey that is just so far above the rest in the competition in the world of truly epic fantasy that's available, that is going to stand the test of time, that somehow manages to be compelling and balance a world that's arguably too big, with so many different intertwining other things going on. It also has a little bit of horror, a little bit of romance, a little bit of mystery. Some of the humor and some of the romantic dialogue doesn't always land in this first book, in my opinion. And, but there's almost nothing to complain about for what it does offer. It's a perfect 10 or 11 out of 10 for me. It's one of my, probably at this point in my life, top 10 favorite books of all time. Words of Radiance is tied with that, so I guess the Stormlight archive itself is in my top 10 favorite books of all time, because it's just such a perfect work of fiction, just a perfect creation. I could talk about other qualities that I'll probably going to think of things later that's going to bother me that, but I think I'll just leave it at that. I highly recommend this book to anyone who needs an epic war story, wants to experience dramatic visuals, wants a good mental challenge, wants to see some amazing magic action, wants to be inspired, wants to get a sort of like energetic and pushback from intellectual processing of, just like what fantasy is really all about. This is like the quintessential best recommended example. Like I can't think of anything better that compares to it in balancing so many different qualities all together to make the complete package. So I have to pay homage to the reality of what this book is. The only criticisms that are serious that I could think of would have to do with talking about what this book is not, and the few things of what it could have done better. And the only thing that seems reasonable to mention is that, and that doesn't seem fair in the first place, because I mostly do my book reviews, content or media reviews, based on what something does offer, as long as it doesn't waste your time. And that doesn't seem really fair, although I do have to mention that Sanderson's prose writing ability isn't anything special. It's very practical and it's very to the point, almost like a film script at times. And sometimes it never reveals the author, it never loses immersion, but it's hard not to feel like it could be more if it had more art to it. So it can be quite dry, like Sanderson. So at times it is not annoying, but tedious, and it leaves you wanting a little bit more for those who care more about art. Like this is definitely not like the flashy more flashier prose like the Kingkiller Chronicle or Tad Williams prose or Tolkien prose or anything like that. But as a storyteller, he's as good or better than all of those authors. So anyway, The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson is a fantasy masterpiece. Most of what I've said you probably, have heard from other critics. But to satisfy my own moral conscience and the debt of gratitude I owe for this book being such a big inspiration for my life, I have to pay it forward. So I forgot one more thing. I read this book while working as a mover in Vegas when I was like 24, surrounded by people that don't speak English around me, just smoking, and people at the time I had nothing in common with, and going way out in the middle of nowhere to rich computer programmers' mansions in the desert, very depressed, and like the moving truck bouncing. I remember reading this with cigarette smoke all around me, just like, and the landscape and the feelings I had related so much to Kaladin, the main character of this book. And it was what I needed at a time in my life where I was very lonely and struggling really hard with loneliness, depression in the workforce, and a lot of hard manual labor that related bizarrely in a really almost mystical meta, like synchronicity type fashion to what this character is going through, and other unfair things that took place in my life in the past. And so I'll always remember the scene of the honor chasm and the contrast to what happens later in the character's life to that moment, and so many other things like that. And the idea of taking a ragtag group of slaves, which are all too familiar if you've ever had any experience in the day-to-day survival job, blue-collar workforce, and becoming something, but with the power of belief, essentially. Like it comes down to the idea of like your royalty, even if you're nothing in spirit, if you believe in and serve and make meaning out of the people around you and your surroundings by making your life about them. And that's where you derive meaning, even in a very hopeless, infinitely unfair, excruciating, racist, classist, unfair situation like Kaladin's. That is eternally memorable and inspiring and will stick with you for the rest of your life. So it is just one of the most, aside from what it's done for the fantasy genre, aside what it is in all the other areas I mentioned, above all else, it's a good story. It's the story, and it has a big heart, and that'll stay with you like pretty much forever. So it is just so perfect. It's just such an epic novel. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Ciao.